Hello everyone, Spaced Oyster here with a strange review of Shadowbringers, the latest expansion for Final Fantasy XIV. I struggled quite a bit with how I wanted to structure this review, which contributed to the delay. Initially, I wanted to do a simple Let's Play of the new expansion, but that plan died, along with my first attempt at recording. I considered doing some sort of basic overview, but I couldn't get the structure quite right, and I missed a few key scenes that I'd need to include. I wanted to do a full story overview, like a few of my favorite critics, but my memory lies to me too much to pull that off, and I can't go back to refresh my memory and capture all the footage I'd need. So I instead opted for this weird sort of commentary thing over the dungeons as a sort of compromise. I'll be rambling about whatever comes to mind as some footage of me going through the story dungeons plays in the background, almost like how Matthew Matosis does his commentaries, but not as well constructed, and with a less sexy voice. There will be spoilers, so if you don't want any of those, I'd recommend watching a different video. The first dungeon of Shadowbringers is Holmester's Switch, which already highlights a slight problem with calling these dungeons. This is actually a city that is under attack by Sin Eaters, the main monsters that ravage the world we have found ourselves in. So, to make sure we have our terminology in order, a dungeon in Final Fantasy XIV is any instance content that is tackled by a group of 4 adventurers. 1 tank to keep the enemies at bay, 1 healer to keep everyone healthy, and 2 DPS to kill everything. Dungeons are usually linear, with no less than 3 boss monsters separated by groups of mobs that are usually easy to sweep up, commonly referred to as trash. This format doesn't leave much room for variety, so most people try to get through dungeons as quickly as possible by sweeping up the trash all at once. The tank will grab as many of the mobs as they can handle, then the DPS will sweep them up, while the healer, heals. I have mixed feelings on these big pulls. They started to get popular at about the same time that I hit the level cap back when that was 50. I couldn't handle them back in the day, given that my gear was horrible and I was quite inexperienced, so my groups tended to die a lot, which frustrated me quite a bit. I've gotten better at healing through big pulls, for the most part, but as you can see here, I still struggle a little bit. It could be that I'm playing as an Astrologian, the healer I struggle as the most, but big pulls do tend to give me a smidge of trouble in most cases, even though I can keep my team alive through them these days. That said, I really don't get the appeal of big pulls. They are extremely risky to do, and one mess up kills the entire party. They're faster, sure, but the high risk means that if you mess up, then the dungeon takes even longer than it would have if you just killed all the mobs normally. I don't get why they're the default. I guess people just gotta go fast. We should also establish some story bits, so everyone can be up to speed. Leading up to the launch of Shadowbringers, 5 members of the Scions of the Seventh Dawn were knocked unconscious and left in a coma. Thancred, Y'shtola, Urianger, Alphino, and Alize. When the person responsible was finally able to make contact with us, at a rather inconvenient time, he provided instructions on how to get to his world, a place that is the first of many reflections of the world we're in. The lore is complicated, but it's basically a parallel universe. The Warriors of Darkness that showed up near the end of the Heavensward storyline were from the first, and they came to our world to try and save their own. Shadowbringers has us going there, meeting this Crystal Exarch and finding a way to get the other Scions home. While we're able to get to the first, and the Exarch is quite helpful and friendly, it turns out getting our friends back will be tricky, so we've decided to stay on the first and help save this world from the threat of overwhelming light to prevent further disasters in our own world. Before getting to the first dungeon, we helped out the twins Alphino and Alize, then they came back with us to the main city. Alphino was playing politician and trying to get the city of Eulamore to fight the Sin Eaters once again, while Alize has been working as a mercenary to try and get to the heart of the Sin Eater problem and murder it dead. The first boss here is the Sin Eater, who converted a woman named Tessalin in Alize's storyline before we got here. That whole situation was quite strange. Both Tellyson and this Sin Eater left the area after her gruesome transformation, when I fully expected to have to fight one or both of them after the fact. Sin Eaters are similar to zombies, in that they can turn people into Sin Eaters, and they seem mindless. Yet, when this big girl showed up and turned Tessalin, they both left immediately afterwards, even though Alize, a kid who's got some sort of Sin Eater virus, and the Warrior of Light were all right in front of them. Anyway, as for this fight we're actually doing, it's not all that interesting. Boss encounters in dungeons tend to use a limited number of attacks. Usually, they'll have an attack or two that can be dodged, usually with some area of effect markers to indicate where they'll hit, another attack that deals damage to the whole party, an auto attack to periodically damage their primary target, and another one that deals a lot of damage to their primary target. They'll sometimes use their attacks in patterns that can make dodging difficult, but not before showing you what their attacks are in a somewhat safe manner. This first boss, for example, will launch an attack that will hit most of the arena, charge towards a safe area, then launch a third, cone-shaped attack with a few linear ones thrown in. As the fight goes on, she'll use this combo twice in a row, and even start using her attack that damages the whole party multiple times in a row. With Shadowbringers, the developers expressed an interest in making it so healers would need to heal more often, since players in the role often spent most of their time attacking rather than healing. This was often because most bosses didn't really require us to heal that much. While the bosses in this expansion do seem to be a bit tougher than before, they don't really hit hard or frequently enough to demand that a healer needs to do nothing but heal, so the role hasn't changed that much. I can understand wanting players to fill the roles as intended, but it seems very odd to me that they're so determined to get healers to play a specific way. They've been very accommodating when players found ways to play that they didn't intend before, such as using the ninja class in Final Fantasy XI as a tank. In that game, ninjas were initially designed to be DPS, but players found a way to tank with their given toolset. Instead of adjusting those skills to force ninjas to be DPS, they added more tank skills to the ninja's toolkit, so they can fill their role more effectively, from what I've heard. I didn't actually play Final Fantasy XI. Another example, from 14 this time, has to do with how players deal with trash. Like I said before, the usual approach is to pull multiple groups and take them all down simultaneously, even though the developers intended for players to handle each group one at a time. Rather than preventing big pulls, the developers instead put in a few artificial barriers of blockage to keep the group from grabbing more enemies than they can handle, while still allowing them to grab enough to speed up the process. They didn't get rid of the option to pull big, just made it safer. With the transition to Shadowbringers, the developers streamlined the game's various classes a lot more. They have overhauled the game quite a bit before, like how Stormblood gave every class a gauge to keep track of their various buffs, but they went a lot farther with Shadowbringers. With all the tank classes, for example, they now all get access to the skill that boosts their aggro generation and defense at level 10 instead of 30. With Heaven's Ward and Stormblood before, they seemed hesitant to change when a class learned a new skill, and would have new abilities be unlocked while leveling to the new cap. Now though, they seem much more willing to restructure the classes for the sake of accessibility, and they even made many of the new skills that were added with Shadowbringers available at lower levels. Admittedly, all the classes feel incomplete until they hit the max level and get all their toys, but they are more functional now than they were before at the previous level caps. In addition to that, they removed technical points, or TP, and gave every job a fixed amount of magic points, or MP, so everyone would only need to work with one resource. Well, that would be the case, but MP is only used by classes that use magic, so resource management is only a thing for healers now. All of the streamlining has been quite handy, making each class easier to learn how to play, but they're also difficult to master. While I've gotten better at healing as an Astrologian, I used to struggle quite a bit with keeping the group alive. I've got a better handle on it now, but I still mess up the timing on a few of my abilities in this dungeon. Final Fantasy XIV lets you unlock and play as every class in the game, with no restrictions, allowing you to stick to one and master it to the best of your abilities, or use more and potentially master every class you find appealing. That said, power creep has become an issue. The content released before Shadowbringers is a lot easier than before, likely because the older content wasn't updated to match the balance changes. As a result, older dungeons, especially those that have been in the game since the launch of A Realm Reborn, are far too easy these days. I'm glad that they're still there and accessible for people who don't have Shadowbringers, but the expansion had quite the negative impact on the difficulty as a result of the changes to the classes. Another aspect of the game that can't be overlooked is the cost. Shadowbringers doesn't come cheap. The expansion itself has the new game price tag of $60, but that alone won't get you started with the new content. In order to get into the expansion, you'll need to get through all of the previous story bits, a massive undertaking in and of itself. If you want to get right into the new content, and I don't blame you if you do, well, you can purchase an auto story skip that will flag everything up through Stormblood as complete for about $25. But that won't get you into Shadowbringers either, because without another purchase to get one of the classes leveled to 70 for another $25, you'd have to level one of them up manually. So that's about $110 just to get right into the new expansion at launch if you're a new player, before factoring in Final Fantasy XIV's monthly subscription cost. You'll get at least 30 days free with your purchase of the game, but any more than that and you'll have to pay a minimum of about $13 a month to keep playing. Final Fantasy XIV is a quality game, one that has been improving more and more as time passes, but I can understand the price keeping people away, and despite this being a good game, the price of entry is a bit much. The next boss we'll be fighting is Tessalin herself. She leaves some puddles on the floor, and will leave one where the party has to bunch up to reduce damage. She'll also charge at people in a specific order, dealing damage to anyone standing between her and her primary target as well. Tessalin can deal more damage than the last boss, especially if you're not careful, but she shouldn't give you much trouble. Honestly, I'm impressed with the variety that the bosses in this game have, when the mechanics are usually dealt with through proper positioning or by attacking the right target. Dungeons usually have pretty simple mechanics, but even tougher trials can usually be dealt with by standing in the right spot and hitting the right buttons, if you want to dumb down the explanation enough. The difficulty is often increased by making the tells for attacks tougher to read, or using them in combinations that are difficult to manage. I also like how these first two bosses have story relevance, even though it's a massive coincidence we'd run into both of them here. The last time we saw them was in a completely different region. It concludes Alize's arc in this expansion rather early, which is a bit disappointing, but they don't need to keep bringing up how sad she is about Tessalin so a later confrontation can still be impactful. We do return to Amarang later, but the later events are largely disconnected from what we did with Alize earlier, so it's good that they wrapped up her story stuffs before then. Alphinaud's going to have to wait quite a bit for his story beats to wrap up, but since they're tied to other characters who are important throughout the story, it's much easier to put off his stuffs for now, especially when he reminds the player of their impact specific to him later. The explanation holds the player's hand a bit, but it's to be expected with how long the game has been going. Players may have forgotten some details about Alphinaud's character from previous expansions, or they may have even jumped directly into Shadowbringers, so a reminder of why Eulamore's events don't sit well with him is nice. With the launch of Shadowbringers, we got two new races, the Hrothgar and Viera, both of which were unfinished at the time. Neither of them can wear most of the hats in the game, they're both gender-locked, and the Viera have limited hairstyle options, which is significantly more than what the Hrothgar got. I've heard that the Playboy Bunny's animations and idle stances were borrowed mostly from other existing races, but I don't know if that's true, and I don't care enough to check. I'm not sure if that would be an upgrade for the Hrothgar though. Most of the Cat Daddy's animations are unique to them, but they're a little off. Cat Daddies are usually hunched over, and most of their animations and idle stances have them with this bad posture. However, when using certain weapons, they'll use the same animations as another race, Rogadines, which would be fine given how similar they are in size, but Rogadines don't hunch over. So when using a weapon that causes the Cat Daddy to mimic a Muscle Daddy, they'll clip into the animations with perfect posture from their hunched over position. This issue is very noticeable when playing as an Astrologian, since a Hrothgar will mimic a Rogadine stance and animations when running or casting, but have their own unique stance when simply standing still with the star globe out. These same issues are present in other classes too, but they're definitely at their worst with Astrologian. Despite my fondness for the Cat Daddies, I do wish their inclusion had been delayed until they had been finished. Same goes for the Playboy Bunnies. While I've got no interest in playing as one, the bunnies should have been prioritized so they'd be ready for launch since they were announced first, instead of the two races being included in such an incomplete state. Time will likely fix this issue though. I'm not a fan of the patch it later attitude, but Square Enix have proven themselves to be dedicated to improving their games over time. Final Fantasy XIV is already a good example of that, with its A Realm Reborn relaunch fixing all of the issues the original game had, as well as subsequent patches improving the game quite a bit years later. And Final Fantasy XV can boast having the same level of care put into improving it after its release as well. The last boss of this first dungeon is the Light Warden Phila. The Light Wardens are simultaneously important and easily forgettable. Our goal here on the first is to prevent it rejoining with our world, the source, and killing the Light Wardens will help with that, somehow. Out of the 5 Light Wardens, only 2 of them have more significance beyond being a Light Warden, with only 1 having plot significance beyond that. Anyway, Phila does have a good variety of attacks to utilize, and it can be tough to figure out how to properly respond to everything he does on your first attempt. He'll use an attack that requires the party to bunch up, he'll lock one party member down, then prepare to use a big attack aimed at them, smash half the arena, and even throw a temper tantrum. Oddly enough, I'd also vouch for him being one of the toughest bosses added into this expansion, in the dungeons at the very least. Bosses in later dungeons don't seem to be as tough as Phila here, but a filthy casual like me isn't the best source for judgments like that. From what I've heard, Phila is a Greek term that refers to brotherly love. The Sin Eaters have an interesting naming convention. As you may have seen with most of the enemies in this dungeon, most of them had similar names, Forgiven and some sort of sin, like lust or cowardice. I'm not sure if the Light Wardens and Sin Eaters have the same naming conventions in the original Japanese text, but I enjoy the concept that the Sin Eaters are forgiven sinners, and the Light Wardens are different forms of love, which is usually considered positive. It's a rather neat concept that fits quite well. In their twisted way, Sin Eaters killing people and turning them into Sin Eaters is like they are forgiving them of their sins. Brotherly love could be the best way to define the Warrior of Light's relationship with the Scions of the Seventh Dawn, especially Alphinaud and Alisaie. They've been a big part of our journey since near the end-ish of A Realm Reborn, bonding with the Warrior of Light throughout their shared journey. The other Scions seem to be quite close with us as well, but these two seem to be the ones we're closest to in the group. When a Light Warden is killed, its ether transfers to the nearest living being, corrupting it and turning the victim into a Light Warden, effectively making them unkillable. Fortunately, the Warrior of Light is able to safely absorb that aether, thanks to the Echo. The Echo is pretty much a catch-all solution to ensure the player character can do whatever they need to do. It contextualizes why we can see where enemy attacks will land, how we're able to get back up and keep fighting after we've all been KO'd, lets us see flashbacks, makes us immune to primal indoctrination, and now it protects us from the Light Warden's corruption. We're basically Superman thanks to the Echo, having all the powers we need to solve whatever problem we face. Still, it would have been nice if the Exarch had mentioned that thing about the Light Wardens, and that we're immune to it before we killed it. Next is Don Meg. This one may look familiar, since it was available at the media tour that a few Final Fantasy XIV related content creators got invited to. Another thing you may have noticed right off the bat is that I'm partied up with 3 of the characters from the story, rather than other players. One big new thing in the Shadowbringers expansion is the trust system, which allows you to go through dungeons with the NPCs who are relevant to the story. They're lacking in a few areas, but they're mostly functional and can clear the content. Their biggest flaw is that they don't multitask well. When they're dodging attacks, that's all they'll do. They won't start using skills again until the attack has finished. In addition to that, they also tend to prefer their single target attacks, even when dealing with a massive number of enemies. All this contributes to lengthy dungeon times, but they'll still guarantee a clear for you. They're available for every story-required dungeon, so your interactions with other players can be kept to a minimum, should you prefer a more solo experience. You'll have to play with other people at least 3 times to finish Shadowbringers' story, but having the trusts as an option for the story dungeons is neat. Once you've finished the story, you'll have the main Scions available to level by doing these dungeons with them, with all their levels starting at 71. I'm not sure what the rewards are for getting them to max level. It seems to be just their Stormblood attire for them to wear instead of their new outfits, but it's nice to be able to make progress with them while leveling secondary classes. Although, it is very inconvenient that they need to be leveled up, rather than being available for all the story dungeons like they were before the endgame. To make up for how the bots can't play as well as human players, they seem to be buffed a bit. Their regular attacks deal more damage than the player equivalent skills, their defenses are higher, and they don't get hit with the same debuffs as the player from boss attacks. Aside from leveling up the trusts themselves, running dungeons with them can be quite handy. The individual enemies give a bunch of EXP when killed, and you'll get to keep all of the loot for yourself, since the bots don't need it. Since you're given a piece of gear from the dungeon that your current class can equip once you've finished, leveling the trusts can be a good way to keep up to date on gear as you're gaining levels through the story. That said, even after they got a boost to their experience gains, it still takes a while for them to keep up with your own level if you don't work with them almost exclusively while leveling. At the very least, they let you avoid a lengthy queue time to even get in, a nice boon for players in the oversaturated DPS role. Running dungeons is definitely my preferred method for leveling other classes, both for the gear and so I can use the class in a group setting. Another option for getting levels is to complete fates, repeating overworld events that usually have players killing one big enemy, hordes of smaller enemies, gathering items, or defending someone or something from someone or something. Fates continually spawn in every area and reward a good chunk of experience, enough that they're probably the most efficient way to level up. In addition to that, the areas in Shadowbringers will give you a new currency for completing fates that can be used at a vendor in those areas for new items, all of whom will sell more stuff when you've completed a large number of fates in their area, making the process of leveling up in Shadowbringers more rewarding than it has been in previous expansions. One issue I've got with the new fates is that they've got their own story bits too. And the context for you getting more stuff from the local vendors is that you're steadily making each region safer. However, fates are always going to occur, even after you've hit the highest rank and supposedly made the region as safe as it can be. I don't mind the fates having a bit of story to them, but it's a bit disheartening to think about how the world is faring poorly if I'm not there to ensure the events are completed. The first boss here is an adorable frog man with a top hat. I'm a little jealous because I can't wear the top hat that goes with the rest of the outfit I've got on for this dungeon. As far as the fight itself goes, this one is pretty tricky. He'll jump up and down, causing geysers to erupt that will deal damage and stun whoever gets hit by them. Get hit by too many, and you're toast. Fortunately, if you get hit by one and end up stunned while in the range for another, you don't get stunned again. I think you still take damage, possibly reduced, but the lack of a stun on the second hit is a rare kindness that keeps this boss from being too punishing. Final Fantasy XIV has been rather infamously referred to as synchronized jump roping, because in the harder trials, at the very least, if everyone isn't dealing with all of the mechanics perfectly, the whole group's odds of surviving drop significantly, even though the number of players in each role is doubled for trials. Many of the tougher trials have a time limit that they need to be finished in before the boss wipes the whole group, so someone getting knocked out makes it tougher to finish the fight within that time frame. Losing a healer is bad for all the obvious reasons, and losing a tank makes it difficult to deal with the situation where the tanks need to change who is the main punching bag. The mechanic being toned down and how punishing it is if it isn't dodged correctly is nice to see in a dungeon boss required to complete the story. After beating the snot out of him, the adorable frog guy runs off and the appearance of the dungeon changes. I can see why they used this one at the media tour. Its story relevance is minimal compared to the rest of the dungeons, and it's a very pretty place, changing at least 3 times throughout. Before we came to the area this dungeon is in, Ilmang, we went through a rescue mission, at the end of which we were defeated by a badass grandpa named Ranjit. The power levels, for lack of a better word, are very confusing in this game. The Warrior of Light has been facing down gods since the early game of A Realm Reborn, around the time when they were level 20. Granted, the Warrior of Light faces down these gods not because they're the strongest person around, but because they're immune to the Primal's indoctrination. Although, even if the Primals are weak, which I doubt, we've still gotten quite strong as a result of all the fighting we've had to do. Many different characters have marveled at our strength over the course of the story, even remarking that they're not sure we're even mortal at times. And yet, this Kung Fu Grandpa was able to beat us, seemingly without much effort if his composure after the encounter was any indication. This was a problem in Stormblood as well, but it's better here, at the very least. Unlike Xenos, Ranjit has a long military history, which does explain why he's such a force to be reckoned with, and despite the ease at which Ranjit seemed to win, he does come across as more grounded than Xenos, who was holding back and effortlessly beat the Warrior of Light at the start of Stormblood. Still, it's quite weird that the Warrior of Light can be beaten so easily at all. It's almost like our strength resets at the start of each expansion. I think that technically did happen at the start of Heaven's Ward, which is also, ironically, the only expansion where we weren't beaten at the start. Relative power is difficult to determine from the player's perspective. Enemies and such all have a level, same as the Warrior of Light, but the biggest factor that affects our player character's strength is their gear, not their level. If Xenos and Ranjit were playing by the same rules as us, then they'd be stronger because they have better pants. But gear only seems to be a factor for the player character, while enemies and NPCs have fixed stats, and their level reflects what those stats are. The last frog here with the trees will try to buff one of them if you don't interrupt him. He's not the first, but I forgot to bring up the other ones, so I'm going to point it out now. One thing I found is that they have to be interrupted. Stunning them does nothing. Interruption used to be referred to as silence, but the devs decided to rework it so things you can interrupt would be more noticeable. When it came to silence before, there was no indication that anything could be silenced. You'd simply need to use a skill that can silence and hope for the best, or try to stun, since it would interrupt as well and affect more enemies. Now though, the cast bar for skills that you can interrupt will flash while the enemy is charging the attack, making it much more noticeable. It's nice that it's easier to tell what it works on now, but these enemies are honestly the only ones I can think of that you'd really want to go out of your way to interrupt. The rest I've noticed are to stop attacks you can dodge, or ones that can deal some decent damage, which can be handy, but aren't as punishing. The buff these little froggies can do can be quite dangerous if the group you're with is grabbing a lot of enemies. Even if the enemy can be stunned instead of just interrupting, interrupt seems to be the better option because it'll fill up the limit break gauge a little bit. The second boss here can be quite punishing. There will be 5 smaller enemies that spawn on the edges of the arena that tether to him, with each one that hits making him bigger. The party's goal is to intercept 4 of the 5 tethers that spawn, so you all grow at the same pace as the boss. If you miss too many of them, I want to say about 4 in total, he'll instantly wipe the whole group. The NPCs can be quite troublesome here since they'll go to intercept their chosen tethers, regardless of where you happen to be. You've got to react to whatever it is they're doing, otherwise this guy will get too big. Beyond that, the only interesting thing that happens in this fight is that 4 additional enemies will spawn that each prevent one person from moving until they are killed. He does this twice, I think. The first time in isolation to show you he can, the second time right before the second set of tethers to try and keep you from blocking them. Final Fantasy XIV is quite good at teaching players what the boss's attacks do, although this is more prominent in trials than in dungeon bosses. A great example of this is the extreme version of the Dancing Plague, where the boss uses all of her available attacks in isolation before using them in combinations that can make them difficult to dodge. These adds that keep you from moving don't cause too much trouble though. The only time they were difficult for me was as a healer when one of the DPS refused to kill the adds. May they rest in peace. People who can't even fill their role effectively aren't worthy of nourishing the Blood Lily. The last stretch of the dungeon is possibly the easiest. There are no more enemies that can buff their allies, and aside from one possibly large pole, none of the enemies between the second and third boss will be able to deal that much damage if you're careful. So let's go over a possible plot hole. Minfilia is referred to as the Oracle of Light, and they mention that she's immune to Sin Eater corruption. Later on, she'll even be able to help mitigate the effects of the corrupted Light Warden ether we've absorbed. However, the NPCs also mention that we're the only ones who can safely kill a Light Warden, although the only time I can think of is in the post-game, and the Light Warden slaying ends up causing problems later. This has me wondering, shouldn't she be immune to their effects as well? Strength shouldn't be an issue here, considering we fight each Light Warden in a group, and she can possibly be in the group for all but the first 2. I'm not sure why she can't safely absorb their ether like we do, or why she can't do it better than us. Perhaps the Scion simply didn't wish to try? I know I wouldn't want to force her to, if I was literally in the Warrior of Light's shoes. However, they don't establish why she can't in the game, as far as I can remember. All that is said is that we're the only ones who can safely kill the Light Wardens, but not why. Is it the Echo? I bet it's the Echo. We technically are the only ones on the first who have it. The last boss here is another giant frog guy, maybe even the same one who was the first boss, I don't know, I wasn't paying that much attention, and he's the best boss I can think of to show off just how much work went into the trust system, possibly another reason why this dungeon was used at the media tour. He starts off pretty normal, but then a few of his attacks get quite hilarious, with one that turns you into an imp if you don't look away, and another that turns you into a frog if you get hit. Shortly after that, he'll make the floor fall out and leave only a small walkway to cross in order to prevent him from wiping the party. The NPCs who are available for this dungeon all have their own reactions to this event. Thancred and Urianger are above it all and just teleport across. Alize, being the reckless wild child that she is, will sprint across, while Alphino and Minfilia will take their time and walk slowly. Even Y'shtola, who wasn't with the group the first time, has her own reactions to the boss's shenanigans, crossing the narrow bridge at a good pace, and reacting to the same things as the rest of the group. It's a big reason why I wanted to do this dungeon with the trust system. The trusts also react when the dapper frogman turns into a giant monster, which can also be quite hilarious. Sadly, I didn't notice this until after I finished this recording, so I don't know if I got a good shot of anything other than their text boxes. At the very least, the trusts were well implemented for this dungeon, and I'm glad I got to give them a shot here. One last thing to note is that if the fight takes too long, the boss will start to reuse the skill that turned him into a giant tentacle monster. But this time, it doesn't work and makes him small. A comedic ending to the scare of an instant wipe for not being strong enough. Although the joke falls flat a bit because he'll rarely try to transform again. Next up is the Kitana Ravel. This is one of the few dungeons with some powerful enemies outside of the boss rooms. There are very few enemies in dungeons, outside of bosses, who are as sturdy as this first guy, that also have an attack more complicated than just hitting the tank, or is well telegraphed. These guys can launch attacks from the statues on the walls that you can dodge by getting behind cover. Sadly, there are only two of them, one right here at the start, and the other right in front of the first boss. Honestly, I do wish they'd add more enemies like this into dungeons. They make the trash mobs a bit more varied. Most of the time, dealing with the trash is a simple affair of grouping them all up and spamming moves that hit multiple targets, while occasionally dodging an attack or two. Most enemies are easy to deal with, even if they do have some good designs. The Warrior of Light is a rather standard character for an MMO, all things considered. Despite not getting to hear them talk, even though we do get to pick a voice, they're not a silent protagonist. They'll speak to NPCs and react to various events as the story unfolds, and even though we have dialogue options, we don't really get to define this character on our own terms very much. Their reception of the character Haurchefant is a good example. The Warrior of Light is quite fond of the rather forward elf, regardless of the player's own reaction to the man. Haurchefant's death is still weighing heavily on the player character, 2 expansions later. The same is true for the revelation that the Light Warden's ether is having a negative impact on the Warrior of Light. Their reaction is very different from the one I had. The player character seems disturbed by the news, probably feeling very afraid that this journey is confronting them with their mortality, but determined to see it through. As far as he's aware, his life is pretty much forfeit anyway. If he dies saving the first, then he has prevented the next calamity. If he fails, he'd be just one of the many casualties. Facing your own potential death can be stressful, but I got a sense of determination with how the Warrior of Light pursued his journey through the first. Personally, I wasn't that concerned with the Warrior of Light's potential death, because I assumed that our plot armor would be too thick to pierce, given that we need a character to play as, and this customizable mute is our stand-in. That, and I assumed Minfilia could finish the job if we fell, or couldn't continue because I thought she was immune to the Light Warden's corruption as well. The first boss here is big on using attacks that don't mark their area of effect with the usual glowing reddish pool of imminent danger. Instead, his attacks are well telegraphed by the statues on the back wall, as well as whichever of his arms gets hulked out. He'll start using both of these attacks simultaneously, making most of the arena a danger zone. Getting hit by either attack will make the poor victim take even more damage from all sources, while the Hulk arm smash will also stun you for a few seconds. Neither of these are all that punishing since his attacks are spaced out a good bit, so players are only in danger if they happen to get hit by both simultaneously. Bosses like this, with a large design, usually use attacks like these that are well telegraphed but unmarked, which can be surprising for new players, but once you get used to it, keeping an eye out for the telegraphs becomes just as standard as avoiding the pools of imminent danger. Honestly, the thing that bothers me most is that the death of the Warrior of Light is treated as the greatest tragedy of the potential catastrophe. I understand that people get a lot more motivated for personal reasons than for those on a larger scale. Heck, both I and the Warrior of Light were motivated to come to the First to rescue the other Scions, not save the world. Yet, I can't help but feel perplexed at how the Warrior of Light's death is treated as worse than the world being thrown into an apocalyptic wasteland. Perhaps it's because the Crystal Exarch is the first to tell us? As far as we're aware, the first time we meet him, he's a stranger. Why would he care so much about the Warrior of Light? That gets answered later, but not knowing that history at the time he reveals our prophesized death makes his fondness for the Warrior of Light rather strange. Perhaps the news would have been more impactful if one of the Scions had revealed the bad future that results in our death. But as it stands, I can't quite grasp why the Warrior of Light is more important than the world. Lore-wise, the Viera and Hrothgar are limited to girls and boys, respectively, because the opposite sex for each species has a low birth rate. It's a neat explanation for why those two are gender-locked, but it also makes a plot hole. We haven't seen many of either on the Source yet, but there are plenty of both races on the First, and that's where the problem is. Why aren't there any bunny boys or lion ladies? Low birth rates doesn't explain why the opposite sexes for both races are entirely absent. The First was almost completely wiped out by the Flood, and all the people who are left have been forced to move into the small portion of the world that was spared. I am very skeptical that these two species would be able to maintain any traditions that would keep them out of sight, considering the dire situation we found the world in. You'd think survival would be more important than tradition at this point. It's a possibility, but still unlikely. There is a technical reason why we don't see the less common sex, though. They aren't actually in the game. If we assume that the development of the Hrothgar and Viera was rushed, then the developers likely didn't program in NPC models of these races that can't be made in the character creator. This problem may get patched out later if they add in lion ladies and bunny boys, but that doesn't excuse the plot hole being present now. The second boss here is rather simple. He just tries to drop rocks on your head. He does semi-consistent damage to the whole group, but as long as you watch out for falling rocks, you'll be fine. What's more interesting is that someone painted spoilers on the walls in this room. They depict the rise of Zodiark and his fall at the hands of Hydaelyn. Emmett Zelch, an Ascian who started tagging along with us after we took out the second Light Warden, explains that's what the paintings depict. He claims that the Ascians summoned the primal Zodiark to save their world, which he did. Then, people started to get concerned that Zodiark couldn't be trusted, or needed to be contained, or something. So they summoned Hydaelyn, who defeated Zodiark, sealed him in the world, then split it. I think. My memory likes to lie to me a lot about Final Fantasy XIV lore, and in general. Regardless, the biggest revelation Emmett makes is that Hydaelyn is a primal, just like Zodiark, Ifrit, and all the others we have slain over the years, which is troubling, if true. It's a claim that fits. Primals can't indoctrinate someone who has been enthralled by another primal, and we can't be indoctrinated. A few of them have even remarked that we've been claimed by another. Since Hydaelyn and Zodiark are also supposed to be stronger than the other primals, it would explain why her influence gives us the Echo. However, that isn't definitive proof either. Hydaelyn is some sort of higher being, so it would make sense that she could protect people from primal influence without being a primal herself, or forcing us to bend to her will like the primals do. The Echo also seems to be something that only people Hydaelyn blesses gets. With the other primals, the indoctrination seems to be the only thing that happens to their servants or victims. That could be because the other primals are weaker, though. We haven't seen much of Zodiark, and he doesn't seem to be in any position to be blessing anyone, so we don't know if he can do the same. We simply don't know that much about Zodiark or Hydaelyn. And that's assuming Emmett isn't lying. And while I'm inclined to believe he's telling the truth, I can understand why people would be hesitant to take him at his word. We do see evidence later on that proves he's telling the truth about the history of his civilization, and this world being one of the many reflections, matches what Hydaelyn can do and how she beat Zodiark, but that doesn't mean he isn't lying about the other details. Hopefully, we'll get to explore more of Hydaelyn and Zodiark's history in the future. Anyway, with the Bat Squatch dead, we get a gorgeous view of the last stretch of the dungeon. So let's go back to a topic that you probably won't think is as pretty. Hrothgar family structure. What can I say? I'm a weird person. What I find equally weird and fascinating is how the Hrothgar exist. At a glance, a population with significantly more men than women shouldn't be possible. It's safe to assume they're mammals, since they're basically feline humans, so we can probably assume they give live birth. Next, from the few times we hear of Hrothgar families, they tend to have family structures that are similar to what most people have in the real world. A husband, a wife, and 1 or 2 kids. On paper, there's no way for them to maintain a sustainable population if they only have 1 or 2 kids and mate for life. Of course, those few families we hear about could be the outliers, but with them being the only examples I'm aware of, possibly even the only examples we have, it paints an unlikely picture. I can think of 4 possible explanations that might shed some light on how they maintain a sustainable population, given what we currently know. The first is that the men bear the young, somehow. I think that's how seahorses work, but I really don't know enough to be sure if a mammal can do the same. Another possibility is that the lady lions really get around. They could move between multiple partners throughout their lives and raise a child with each. The few situations we see of a Hrothgar husband mourning his wife don't necessarily mean he was the only man she married, but this explanation is unlikely. It'd make family lineages tough to track, which would create a risk for inbreeding, something I'm sure any intelligent species would want to avoid. They could give birth to litters, like cats, but that's probably not likely either. The one example with a kid mentioned that he and his wife only had one. It's possible that Hrothgar could raise their kids collectively, or they spread the kids out among various parents, but it's a bit shaky. Magnus, a Hrothgar the player encounters a bit later in the story, lost his wife and son after he moved. If the kids are raised communally, then I don't know why he'd take one of the kids with him. On the other hand, if a majority of the kids are adopted by a single parent or even gay couples, then that could be an explanation for why Magnus only had one son. Although I'd imagine it'd be tough for the mothers to give their children away for other people to raise. Interspecies romance is highly frowned upon, so it's unlikely that Hrothgar look for partners outside of their species. The last explanation I can think of is also the simplest, and probably most likely. Hrothgar live long and can make babies for most of their lives. A long lifespan, coupled with being able to reproduce throughout most of it, would allow them to make a sustainable population with monogamous couples. Their government could even provide incentives for couples to have more kids if the population gets low, like the Quarians in Mass Effect. Again, though, these assumptions are based on limited knowledge. I could be completely off base about everything, or possibly misinformed. I'd love to see more of Hrothgar's society. As for the Viera, I don't find them as interesting because they're easier to understand and have been present in other Final Fantasy games. With more women than men, they'd be able to easily maintain a sustainable population, assuming they reproduce similarly to humans or bunnies. It's neat that they separate their boys and girls, only meet up to bone, and that the boys are significantly more isolated, but all the questions I have regarding Hrothgar are answered for the Viera, so I'm not as interested in them. They're also not as sexy. The last boss here is the third Light Warden, Eros. Eros refers to love based on lust, which is an odd name considering this looks like a Native American Cerberus. I don't know much about Greek mythology, so I have no idea if Cerberus has any stories involving love or lust associated with him, but his appearance might be fitting if there are. Oddly enough, Shadowbringers is the first expansion for Final Fantasy XIV where the Warrior of Light doesn't seem to have any implied love interest. In Heavensward, we had Haurchefant, who wasn't shy about wanting to get into the Warrior of Light's pants. In Stormblood, we got a bit of ship tease with Bliss and Hien, who weren't nearly as explicit as Haurchefant was, and their crush on the Warrior of Light probably wasn't based on lust, but a romantic relationship with either of them seems like a plausible outcome. I suppose Xenos counts too, in some sort of twisted way, but that Mary Sue seems to regard the Warrior of Light as a friend, rather than having some sort of crush. Shadowbringers doesn't seem to really have anyone romantically interested in the Warrior of Light, though, lustful or otherwise. Minfilia is too young, and our relationship with her comes across as paternal. The Crystal Exarch seems to be in awe of us, like a fan meeting their idol, and the Scions maintain the same relationship they had with the Warrior of Light as before, if a bit more distant because of our time apart. That doesn't really impact the plot much, I just thought it'd be interesting to bring up. Eros is a neat encounter, requiring good positioning to effectively dodge his attacks. One aspect of this fight I found funny is that when he uses an attack that requires the party to bunch up, he'll also attack the edges of the arena. It took me a good while to notice that because every group I've gotten instinctively moved right in front of him. I only noticed the other part of the attack after I forgot to move to the right spot one time. After that, it's off to Malika's Well. The story started to drag a bit here, but that's honestly to be expected at this point. The last area established the danger of killing the Light Wardens, and even showed that it was starting to have a negative effect on the Warrior of Light when Eros died. Killing the Light Warden here does the same thing. However, killing the Light Warden is necessary, and revealing the danger now instead of earlier may not have worked. It probably would have come across as the writers trying to pull drama out of their ass to add more tension. Technically, that could be why absorbing the Light Warden's aether is dangerous in the first place, but they established that danger quite well when Y'shtola pointed it out before the previous dungeon. She can see people's aether, and that we've got a lot more light-aspected aether than we should from the last two Light Wardens, and we were searching for her, so having her point out the danger makes sense. From a story point, the Light Warden slaying, while still important, is also on the back burner. Instead, we got some development for Thancred and Minfilia before coming here, solidifying the young girl's resolve and making Thancred a bit less of a whiny jerk that treats her like a child he never wanted, but feels obligated to raise. Thancred even beat Ranjit on the way here, grounding Kung Fu Grandpa and establishing that our gang is growing stronger. He's still a potential threat to the group, but he's far less ridiculous than Xenos now. That said, it is weird that he survived his big fall through sheer badassery. On the way here, I also started to get increasingly annoyed by the hostile mobs in the overworld. They didn't bother me as much in Heavensward or Stormblood, but here in Shadowbringers, they become quite a nuisance again. The more I think about it, the more I despise the hostile overworld mobs. Simply put, there is no good reason for the enemy mobs to be hostile in the overworld. They're unnecessary as a beef gate because low-level players have no reason to go to high-level areas, if they can even get in. Any gear they could obtain can't be equipped until they reach a higher level, and getting the gear before they can equip it doesn't make the game any easier. They won't be able to do quests either because they can't be turned in until the player's level is high enough. All of the mobs being hostile breaks immersion too. For the most part, wild animals in the real world tend to want to avoid people. Why isn't that true in Final Fantasy? Because it's fantasy? They've shown to be grounded and realistic in other areas, such as still inflicting fall damage if the player lands in water, so why isn't the wildlife behaving realistically? Having hostile enemies in an area can be a good way to tell the player a bit about the place through the environment, like how Imperial bases are full of hostile Imperial soldiers. But ever since Heavensward, nearly every enemy has been hostile. And wait, there's more! Players are usually never going to fight these monsters. Generally, it's faster to run away until the enemy loses interest than go back to whatever the objective is unimpeded. Players are unlikely to actually fight these monsters unless running away hasn't worked, if the monster in question is one they'll need to fight for a quest objective or materials, or if there's a reward associated with killing a certain number of those monsters, usually a currency for whatever they're calling the Hunter's Guild now. If there's no reason to fight an overworld monster, players are simply going to avoid them, hostile or not. They're little more than an annoyance. The first boss here is quite sturdy. Nearly every group I've been in has taken a while to kill it, but I'm not sure why. While he does get the group to move around a lot, he still takes longer to kill than I expect, even when the whole group is positioned optimally. He does get some help, but killing the smaller monsters doesn't take that long, and the attacks that require people to back up don't take very long for him to execute either. It's not a problem with the healers. Every healer I've seen contributes as much DPS as they can when they don't need to heal, so our damage output is a bit higher than what the developers expect. Maybe I've just been really unlucky, and everyone in every group I get has low damage output. I wouldn't be surprised to learn that I'm shit at dealing damage. He's probably the toughest boss here, which is weird since he's the first. It is neat that he uses another attack that will hit anyone that stays close to where they bunched up for the last one, but beyond that, he's just a surprisingly sturdy boss. Honestly, at this point, I've gotten quite tired of the typical dungeon format. I do enjoy Final Fantasy XIV, but going down a corridor, killing a bunch of enemies, then fighting a bigger guy who hits kinda hard gets kinda dull after a while. Sadly, I don't know what a good alternative would be. The dungeons designed to help people level up quickly, Palace of the Dead and Heaven on High, have randomly generated layouts and usually get quite chaotic with pretty simple floor plans and a high enemy density. They're different from the usual dungeon format, but they get old rather quickly too. Despite possibly being the best way to get to level 70, people seem to avoid Palace of the Dead and Heaven on High on their way to the top. On the other hand, making the layout too big or open-ended could be bad if the group gets separated. Only a tank is able to take repeated abuse from the enemies, a healer is needed to effectively keep the group healthy, and without classes dedicated to dealing damage, the enemies would take a long time to kill. Keeping the layout linear makes it easier for players to get back to where they were before, should they all happen to get taken out. Generally, attempts to mix up the dungeon designs don't really work out, similar to how the gimmick boss fights in Dark Souls usually aren't well received. But that could be because they didn't do much for variety. They advertised Hullbreaker Isle as being a dungeon that's different every time you go through it. That's technically true, but in the laziest way possible. In order to get through Hullbreaker Isle, you'll need some items that drop from some of the enemies, and which ones drop the items are randomized. The second boss here is quite similar to one encountered in the Ritterana Lighthouse raid from Stormblood. He does a big attack with a large radius around him, pushes people back, then starts launching an attack right in front of him that deals a lot of damage, then continues to use it while he spins around. It's a neat encounter, providing players with the challenge to keep moving while avoiding his deadly attacks. Caster-type characters, like black mages, may have to stop attacking for a bit so they can keep moving, while melee DPS, such as monks, won't be able to get their positional bonuses, so nearly everyone suffers. Players who came into the game with Shadowbringers are unlikely to recognize these attacks because they'd have no reason to do the Ritterana Lighthouse now, aside from wanting to experience it themselves or get the outfits to dress up in. It's similar to how the Shadowbringers plot makes reference to the Crystal Tower raids, but those aren't required either, so they had to write the story to accommodate for players who haven't done them. It's not a problem with the boss fight, the mechanics are easy enough to figure out, but the plot certainly suffers. For example, as we learn later in the story, instead of the Crystal Exarch being the man we helped out in the Crystal Tower, he's the same man from a different timeline who traveled back in time to the first. Somehow. Time travel usually turns into cancer for any plot that uses it, but I don't know what else to suggest. Making the Crystal Tower raids mandatory wouldn't have been a good option because they require 24 people, were first added into the game in A Realm Reborn, and don't provide a benefit that'll keep players coming back. There's no guarantee that people would help out with the raids if they were suddenly mandatory. Although, I could be wrong. Players can queue up for a daily bonus that can put them into the Crystal Tower raids for a lot of experience points, and that seems popular, so I could be wrong. Same as how the two dungeons that finish out A Realm Reborn still get plenty of activity for the same reason. I'm not sure, but it's nice that people can get into Shadowbringers without having to climb the Crystal Tower. The next part of the dungeon looks weird. Everything seems to be turning white, as if the Light Warden is corrupting the area around it. This is an interesting effect, but it's curious what the cause is. Power is the most likely answer. It's a massive coincidence that we're taking out the Light Wardens in order from weakest to strongest, but given that the last two we face are the only ones that change the environment they're in, and their levels are higher than the other three, it's reasonable to assume that they're stronger in the story as well. It's not related to time. Titania and Eros didn't change their environment at all, even though they have been in their respective locations for just as long, if not longer, than the Light Warden in this well. The environment changing thing could be tied to some sort of skill, too, one that the other Light Wardens we've faced up to this point had not learned yet. Getting stronger seems to be tied to getting more skilled in this world. Ranjit has years of experience, and Xenos was supposedly a Dragon Ball Z character that spent all of her time training or fighting. Power or skill, the end result is the same. The Light Warden here is tougher than the others we've fought, and being able to affect its environment serves as evidence. As for the Light Warden at the bottom of this well, it's quite the interesting encounter. I already mentioned that the Dancing Plague Extreme has the boss running through all of her mechanics before using them in more complex patterns, and Storage here is another good example of that same design aspect. Storage has two attacks that you should be able to dodge somewhat easily, one that hits in 4 cardinal directions around it, and another that hits the whole arena except right underneath the weird creature. After cycling through both of these attacks, it'll then start dropping down pillars that will use these attacks one after the other. It's safe to assume the players will know how to react because they've already been shown both of the attacks in a safe manner. Storage refers to familial love. Another more commonly used word for it is platonic. It's quite thematic that we're encountering the Light Warden named for familial love after Thancred has finally realized he needs to act like a father figure to Minfilia, rather than continuing to be a dick to her because he wants the woman he cared for and grew attached to back. He was presented with a possibility to get the original Minfilia back, but it would come at the cost of the girl he saved and has been caring for here on the first. By this point, he's accepted the lost and has been treating Minfilia better, which is nice, but it doesn't excuse how much of a dick he has been up to her up to this point. I honestly don't care for Thancred in this expansion. The other Scions do seem to treat Minfilia well, but they all seem so distant towards her too. Perhaps they have that same conflict? Being around a young woman that reminds them of the good friend they lost does sound uncomfortable. If it wasn't already obvious, I'm not a very good tank. Of the 3 roles in the game, tank is the one that I have the least experience with, and one change that Shadowbringers brought to all of the classes in this role have made it tougher for me to play. They all have fewer defensive skills, I think. Before, tanks usually had enough skills that boosted their defenses to allow them to keep at least one up at all times, so I'd cycle through the defensive buffs one at a time. Now, tanks have fewer skills like that, or Paladin does, at the very least, meaning that it's best to save the defense boosts for when you're expecting to take more damage than normal, such as when the boss is charging their tank buster to deal massive damage, or when you've grabbed all the mobs. Regardless, because I'm not very good at tanking, I tend to avoid playing the role, so I don't get much better, thus avoiding the role even more. It's a self-deprecating cycle of refusing to be a meat shield. After beating Storage, we get a cutscene showing us absorbing its Aether, and that it's causing damage. Nothing strange about that, as I've already mentioned, but the placement of this cutscene is odd. With the other Light Wardens we faced in dungeons, they had a cutscene similar to this one that played after we left. It's strange that they put the cutscene right after beating the boss this time. I'm honestly not sure why. Seeing it a little bit earlier than usual doesn't make the scene any more impactful, and people are more likely to skip the scene so they can get out of the dungeon and move on. Maybe they figured that cutting out the victory fanfare that normally plays at the end of a dungeon would make this situation more dire. Mount Gulag is appropriately climactic. The last Light Warden, Vothri, fled here, and we had to get help from all the people we've met up to this point to catch up to him. We're essentially on the verge of saving the First, completing our mission, and being able to move on to getting everyone back to the source. It's quite the climax for this part of the story. Of course, it's rather apparent that this isn't the finale for Shadowbringers. There's still one more area that we have yet to explore, and while there's no rule saying that we have to visit every area before finishing the story, this would have been the first time if they had done it that way. The other pretty major hint that there's more to do after climbing Mount Gulag is the writing. Specifically, Emmett Zelch. He's made it no secret that he wants the First to rejoin the Source in the hopes that the world will become more whole and bring him one step closer to summoning Zodiark. Yet he's done nothing to stop us from slaying the Light Wardens that were helping to nudge this world closer to rejoining the Source. He said he's willing to pursue a more peaceful solution alongside the Scions for his goals, and seems to hope that such a solution is possible, but him choosing to abandon that potential alliance for his own needs isn't out of character. Like most men, there's only one thing that he wants. Unlike most men, he wants to resurrect his god and save his people at any cost. For this dungeon, I decided to go as my preferred class, Scholar. Honestly, I'm probably not very good at it. My bad habit is that I heal too much, spending more resources than necessary to keep the group healthy. It's not the worst habit to have, but knowing that I could be attacking more always makes me nervous when doing tougher content. I'm usually worried that I'm letting the group down when attempting high-end content, that I'm not doing enough damage, and my suboptimal performance is holding the group back. It's not too big of a deal though, I have plenty of fun without doing the toughest content. Rather, I wanted to ramble about how difficult it is to tell if I'm over-healing as a Scholar. With Eos constantly casting her own healing spell, she'll be able to get everyone to full health eventually, assuming no one takes more damage in the meantime. Ideally, I should be aware of when people are going to take damage, and can leave Eos to top people off unless she's unable to heal them enough before the next big hit. Ideally, but I can't help but fill up the health bars and make them look pretty. Perfect optimization isn't necessary in a dungeon though, because I'm the only healer. With high-end trials and raids, it's possible to keep everyone completely healed up without casting a single healing spell thanks to having 2 healers. But when you're the only one, keeping everyone healthy without using those healing spells is a bit tougher. One thing I really like about Mount Gulag is that, just like the first dungeon, 2 of the 3 bosses here are Sin Eaters we've encountered in the world before. That's where the similarities end, though. This lion-like thing was simply sitting in Vothri's chamber, rather than doing something story-related, like turning a nice girl into a Sin Eater in a very gruesome sequence. Still, it's nice to see a familiar face. This guy makes up for his lack of story relevance by being a bit challenging. He'll charge up attacks that don't have an indicator for their area of effect, so you'll need to be vigilant to dodge them. Nothing new, but a few of the AoEs flash on the ground before their impact, probably just to rub salt in the wound if you didn't dodge. Having those danger zones pop up for a second is handy so we can be sure of where to dodge in the future, but it's a bit frustrating that they pop up for a brief second to indicate that we failed to dodge. I decided to go as a healer again for this dungeon, and one thing that's become quite apparent is that all the healers are quite potent in this expansion. All 3 of them have ways to instantly heal the party, to the point that if everyone's dodging, you don't even need to cast a single healing spell. Scholar alone gets 4 abilities that heal the whole party, instantly, for minimal cost. 5 if you count the one that can be used twice with Seraph. Giving us so many ways to heal has made it so we don't need to heal as often, kind of undermining the developers' desire to make healers heal more. Keeping everyone topped off is easier than ever before, leaving more time for attacking. A niggle I have with the story of Shadowbringers is that we're supposed to be the villains in this world. One aspect the story seems keen to set up is that the First has no love of heroes, and that accomplishing our goals will require us to embrace the darkness, the main element associated with our enemies, and become the villains of this world to save it. Despite being monsters, the Sin Eaters are referred to as virtues or forgiven, and the citizens here call each other sinners, as if they're embracing the idea that they are becoming evil to oppose the forces that have engulfed most of their world. Even the advertising leading up to the launch of this expansion played up the idea of being villains in the first. However, it doesn't really work out that way. Our actions are in no way villainous, except maybe in the context of the enemies we face. We're villains in Vothri's eyes because we're destroying his utopia. But Ulamore wasn't exactly a good place, with the citizens being fed baked sin eaters so they could be mind-controlled. The society was also one that had the wealthy propped up on the backs of the poor, with those who had money being lavished in luxury, while those without wait on the needs of the rich citizens they serve, being allowed into the city being seen as payment enough for their services. Toppling Ulamore was quite heroic. We're villains to Emmett Zelch because we're opposing the resurrection of his god that will save his people and restore the world to its former glory. But in order for Emmett Zelch to accomplish his goals, he'll need to sacrifice the lives of everyone who lives on the source and the remaining reflections. Stopping him saves countless lives. We're not villains by any stretch of the imagination, which is fine. However, I would not have minded a story where we have to shake up the status quo and cause permanent damage to the civilizations of this world in order to prevent its destruction and ultimately save it, taking on the mantle of a villain for our own goals. Heck, I may have preferred that. Also, I don't quite get the timeline for the Warrior of Darkness, Ardbert. He came to the source back in Heavensward, however long ago that was. Then when we defeated him, original Minfilia brought him and his companions back to the First, where they halted the Flood. According to him, the world had already been ravaged by them beating their villains, but from what we've been able to gather, it was the Flood that wiped out most of the First. Was the Flood occurring while Ardbert and his friends were on the Source? Time could have been going very slowly on the First while they were gone. The flow of time being wonky has been established, so that works, I guess. While we're on the subject, if the Everlasting Light was a result of Hydaelyn's influence, unimpeded, then why would the original Minfilia, the voice of Hydaelyn, stop the Flood? Shouldn't the Everlasting Light, and everything that comes with it, be Hydaelyn's ideal world? Hopefully, we can get a better understanding of her in the future. I'm curious if she's actually benevolent. By the time we've gotten to the second boss, this place has gotten too bright for my liking. This is demonstrable proof that the Light Wardens are capable of altering the world around them, and that it's likely tied to either their power or ability. As the final Light Warden, one who was quite literally bred to be powerful enough to bring about the end of the world, Vothri is reasonably strong and skilled enough to alter the environment, as we're seeing here, which also confirms that Storage was skilled and or powerful. The area is pretty, but it's so bright that I have a really tough time looking at it. I suppose that's the point. Overwhelming light is bad, or whatever. But having a level in a game that is uncomfortable to look at was not a good idea. Dodging attacks in this bright area can be quite difficult, with all of the area of effects blending in with the ground. I think they recently patched it so everything isn't so bright, but it still hurts my eyes. Dodging is not much of a problem with this second boss, with how well the big face wall's attacks are telegraphed, but it could be quite an issue with the trash before and after this encounter, especially if the group is pulling all the mobs together. Another thing that bothers me about the whole story in Final Fantasy XIV is that they've established that if the forces of light and darkness don't stay balanced, then it causes problems. The first shows what happens if the good guys win and completely crush their enemies, that such a resounding victory drowns the world in overwhelming light. The first time the Crystal Exarch called us on the Source and snatched Thancred, the Alliance had formulated a good plan to throw the Empire into chaos and hopefully beat them. I had assumed he was some sort of divine being responding to the forces associated with the light growing too strong, but that wasn't the case. I'm becoming increasingly suspicious of the balance that the world needs to maintain. From what little we know of the world, this need for balance wasn't necessary when the Ascians were the main intelligent species and the world was whole. Did balance become necessary after Zodiark was summoned? Primals do absorb a lot of Aether, so Zodiark likely started to cause a lot of damage simply by existing. That, or maybe Hydaelyn splitting the world created the need for balance, for some reason. So far, all we know is that if there's not enough of one element to balance out its opposite, then the world gets overwhelmed with the dominant element. But even if that was confirmed from the writers, I don't see how the Empire is responsible for maintaining any of the elements. There are demons and such that are associated with the dark, as are the remaining Ascians, while the Warrior of Light seems to be the largest source of light ether, powerful but solitary. I don't even know why I'm trying to make sense of it. The whole idea of maintaining balance is absolutely silly. It completely kills my motivation to keep the balance because some of the forces needed in the world to maintain balance are also trying to disrupt that balance. Stopping them does no good because they don't seem to care, but I can't eliminate them because that'd be just as bad as doing nothing. They probably went with this balance nonsense so players have a reason to keep coming back, and having villains who are aware of and don't care about balance is nice, I guess, but it's still a bad plot point all the same. The last boss of Mount Gulag is rather punishing. After Vothri starts yelling, she'll buff her attacks to have an added area of effect. This would be fine, except we get no indication of how her attacks have been buffed. At least she's consistent, but with how much she punishes you for not dodging, it's rather cruel to have no indication of how her attacks have changed. She's got quite the varied moveset, so things can get tricky, but as long as you're vigilant, wary, and still able to see after walking around this extremely bright locale, you should be fine. Removing the area of effect indicator, or only flashing it at the last second, seems to be the developer's go-to method for adding difficulty to nearly any encounter. It works, I suppose, but it's also a little cheap. The early game places emphasis on making sure to avoid standing in the red danger zones to avoid damage, only to later remove those danger zones entirely so players will have a tougher time reacting. Granted, the attacks that lack the danger zone are either well telegraphed, or the player can be expected to reasonably understand where the danger zone is. Many of the extreme trials are a good example of this. In the regular fight against Byakko, his sweep the leg attack has a massive danger zone that is well telegraphed, with the area of effect marked as he charges the attack. When challenging the extreme version, he'll still sweep the leg, but you won't be able to see the area of effect. Since clearing the normal encounter is required to unlock the extreme version, the developers know that everyone who attempts this encounter has seen Byakko's sexy kick, and knows where to go to dodge it. When a dungeon boss doesn't show the danger zones, they usually telegraph their attacks quite well, so it's easy to tell where the attack will land. This boss is one of the rare exceptions for a few of her attacks, but since she's consistent in how she uses them, the player should only get hit once due to ignorance, as long as they're paying attention. Amarot is the last story dungeon of Shadowbringers. Emmett Zelch has recreated his home on the day of its ruin in the hopes of seeing if the Scions are truly capable of helping him achieve his goals through different means. His willingness to work with us and give the Warrior of Light as much benefit of the doubt as he can indicates his familiarity with us. The Warrior's identity has always been in question over the course of the story. We've had people previously marvel at our strength and ask in horrifying astonishment, "What are you?" as if to indicate that we're not even mortal. Emmett Zelch sheds some light on our identity, but doesn't fully verify who we are, which is okay, I suppose. The only thing that's been revealed is that we used to be an Ascian, and that we've been fractured, just like the world. We can explore a strange history later. Setting it up now means we have something to look forward to with content that is likely to come later. For now, let's speculate for jits and shiggles. The way I see it, there are two possibilities for who we were. The first, and most likely possibility, is we're an old friend of Emmett's from before the world went to shit. We ran into a memory of this guy at the DMV who exposited some things while we waited. He was well aware that he's a memory, possibly by accident on Emmett's part, and he seemed to be more aware of our situation as one fragment of the whole person we used to be than anyone else. I wonder if the Warrior of Light told the other Scions about that. I know I would, in his shoes, but maybe he's keeping it a secret for reasons. I think this is likely who we were because Emmett seems to be somewhat fond of us, and near the end, when we get a power-up with Ardbert's help, Emmett sees us as an Ascian. However, that isn't definitive proof. Every Ascian we've seen here has looked exactly the same, and Emmett could just as likely have had the same reaction to the other person we might be, the newly assigned 14th member of the Council. From our brief time here, we learned that the Ascians were led by a council of 13 individuals, and that they had recently elected a 14th member in the wake of the end of the world. This 14th member is quite mysterious, and we don't know much about them. But considering how much influence they had in the events that led to the world as we know it, there is the possibility that we were the ones shaping events so significantly. Although, I don't think this possibility really holds up. The other Ascians we've encountered don't seem to recognize us as anything other than Hydaelyn's champion. Since they've all been a part of that council, they'd be familiar with the 14th member, even broken as we are now, so I think it's more likely that we were the friend of them and such. Finally, the fact that we are a part of this fragmented Ascian may confirm that Hydaelyn is a primal. We're likely in our current state because we tried to confront her after she beat Zodiark, or maybe even fought alongside him. After being split, we were probably made vulnerable to her influence, and she's now using us to shape the world to what she wants. Maybe. Speculation can only get us so far, and while I'm excited for what the potential answers are, I'm a little tired of answers being put off till later. Speaking of fragments, this first boss is pretty good at getting the party to separate. The markers he puts on people flags their current position as the spot where meteors will drop, that we later use to dodge an even bigger meteor this thing drops from the sky. In what seems to be a trend with Shadowbringers, this guy is easily the toughest boss in this dungeon, dealing consistent damage to the whole group and punishing people very thoroughly if they don't adequately dodge his plethora of attacks. Couple that with how difficult it is to stay in range to hurt him, and he can take a while to beat too, especially if your group has a shit melee DPS like me in it. One of the most interesting aspects of this encounter is that the background environment reflects the damage the boss is doing. Some of the attacks are shown to be collapsing buildings, and after they've hit, the buildings on the same side as the attack with the large area of effect will be gone. As a whole, the writing of Shadowbringers has been pretty good. They set up plot details to capitalize on later, unlike some other stories I could The Last Jedi, and it's honestly quite refreshing to see a story that has setups and payoffs. If you're paying attention, then the plot is quite predictable, and that is fine. After seeing quite a few stories that compromise their consistency for the sake of using a twist I wouldn't see coming, I found it very refreshing to see a story that didn't have a surprise twist. For example, the twist that Vothri is a Light Warden was set up from the moment you arrived in Ulamore. With our first visit there, we were told that he controls Sin Eaters, and that the people of the city live in harmony with the monsters thanks to his leadership. And since we were exposed to Ulamore before being made aware of Light Wardens, players likely aren't thinking about the Light Warden of the region Ulamore is in because we're being rushed to the other areas first, allowing it to function as a twist if you're not paying that much attention, but still being set up well in advance. The characters all turned out well too. For a few examples, the Exarch behaved like a fanboy who wanted to interact with us more, but needed to keep his distance. Each of the Scions show growth from their time on the First and seem somewhat distant, even though they all seem to have roughly the same opinion of us, and Emmett Zelch makes for a good villain. His motivations make sense, and while they are sympathetic, they don't necessarily make him sympathetic. Resurrecting his race means destroying all life as we know it. Add in some of his personal quirks and his willingness to cooperate with us, and he makes for quite the interesting character. The story isn't perfect, as few things in this world are, but I felt engaged from start to finish and was continually excited to keep going. The second boss here is pretty unique. After dealing enough damage, he'll leave the arena and call in a bunch of adds. There will be 3 waves of enemies, then the giant chicken will come back and start to explode. I'm probably in the minority here, but I do enjoy most of these bosses that change up the usual formula. They're not always good, but they're often varied enough for me to find them interesting. The various hordes are able to keep up some semblance of challenge by being rather large and having some high priority targets that can cause some problems. The first of these are bombs that tether to one of the DPS people. These guys will constantly reduce their target's fire resistance, then explode when killed, dealing massive damage to anyone with low fire resistance. Thankfully, not enough to kill them from full health, but the damage can still be dangerous. The second enemy to watch out for tethers to a healer and reduces the effectiveness of their healing spells. The lowered healing can potentially be deadly, but it's usually not a problem. For the most part, killing these enemies quickly is the only thing the group can do, but if the tank is a paladin, there is another option. Paladins get a skill called Cover that allows them to take all the damage directed at another party member. Since these enemies cause their debuff by dealing damage, a paladin can cover the target, preventing them from getting debuffed in exchange for taking a little more damage themselves. It's not a good idea to do this with the bombs though, since the explosions hit everyone nearby when they go off, so the reduced fire resistance would be even worse on the tank, but preventing the healer from getting debuffed can be quite a boon, since the paladin's lone healing spell probably won't be necessary. For the most part, the different classes in this game have very little synergy with each other. There used to be quite a bit, but the developers cut out the buffs and debuffs that only benefited specific classes. For example, Dragoons used to reduce the enemy's piercing resistance, which would boost their own damage, as well as the damage dealt by bards and machinists. With Shadowbringers, the developers wanted to even out the classes a lot more, so raid groups could have more variety, rather than there being specific class combinations that players would seek out for the highest damage output. Now, only a few classes can provide buffs or debuffs that increase another party member's damage, and of those, they all affect every other class. Dancers buff whoever their dance partner is, boosting their damage and critical hit rate a bit. Astrologians provide small damage buffs to the whole group, and ninjas can debuff the boss so they take more damage from all sources. While this does make the few classes with access to good buffs and debuffs more desirable, classes that don't have as much synergy aren't as undesirable as before. From what little I understand, dancers and ninjas have low damage output by themselves to make up for how much they benefit the whole group. They're still desirable, but they won't make the whole group better on their own. Meanwhile, classes with little to no synergy, such as Black Mage, contribute a lot to the party with their large damage output. The last boss here has a time limit to it. At least, I think there's a time limit. He'll destroy more and more of the arena as the battle goes on, so I assume that he'll eventually take out the whole area. But I've never seen him do that, even when I got a group that was worse than the trust system. I've had a friend say they did, but that's not exactly conclusive. They sounded very frustrated about it though. The time limit is generous here, but other bosses with similar restrictions are often less forgiving. Most extreme primals will reach a point where they'll wipe the whole group if the fight takes too long after moving to their final phase, usually after rotating through their mechanics a few times. I'm normally not a fan of time limits, but in these cases, they're fine by me. The encounters are tightly designed, and the only way you'll run out of time is if the group isn't performing well. The developers likely put time limits on a lot of encounters in Final Fantasy XIV because some of the content they designed in the last Final Fantasy themed MMO, 11, could last for hours, according to some rumors I heard. A somewhat strict time limit ensures that the fights won't last too long, while being generous enough so that players who are good enough at the game can clear the content they are attempting. It's still frustrating to lose due to running out of time, but that's rarely happened to me, and I'm a filthy casual. Case in point, as a DPS, I often suffer from tunnel vision, either focusing too much on keeping my combos up that I forget about the boss mechanics, or neglect to keep my combos up because I'm too concerned with what the boss is doing. Dragoon is a fun class, jumping around is quite satisfying, but my lack of focus would keep me from excelling in the role. This is one of the reasons I prefer being a healer. Healing is largely reactionary, so it's easier to focus on what the boss is doing. Another reason is that when I played DC Universe Online, people could queue up for the healer role even if they were playing as a DPS, causing us to go through those dungeons and such without a healer. I hated not having one, so I figured I'd do it myself. The best way to ensure that my group always has a healer is to be the healer. Final Fantasy XIV is a lot more strict with party compositions, so not having a healer is almost never an issue. The only way you wouldn't have one in your group is if they left in the middle of the dungeon, or if you queue in a group that intentionally doesn't have one. And with that, we've gone through all the story-required dungeons of Shadowbringers. There is more content. 2 more dungeons, 3 regular trials, and 2 extreme versions at launch, with even more content added with later patches. For this review though, I wanted to stick to the story dungeons since I wanted to ramble about things related to the story, and such. Despite the content being difficult to get to for new players, I'd highly recommend giving Shadowbringers a shot if you're looking for an MMO to play. The story and gameplay are both good, and while the character creation stumbles in 2 areas, the developers are usually quite good about fixing the problems in this game. As always, thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.